cold autumn rain hammered against the pavement, turning Chicago's streets into silver ribbons where streetlights flickered and stretched. The wind cut like a blade, tossing wet leaves into her face, tugging at the hem of her worn-out coat. Megan Carter walked north, clutching her son tightly against her chest. Noah pressed into her, his breath uneven in the chill, small fingers wrapped around a keychain shaped like a wrench. It was a ridiculous treasure, scratched, cheap, long forgotten by whoever had owned it first. But for him it was everything, and for her it was proof that they still had something left to hold on to. Beyond the iron gates rose the mansion. Stone walls, tall windows streaked with rain. A place too silent, too large, too closed off. It looked more like a mausoleum than a home. Megan stopped at the gate. Her breath left her in clouds of white. Her throat was dry. She had walked here 3 times before only to turn back. But tonight the fridge at home was empty, the milk souring. Tonight Noah had whispered, "Mommy, I'm hungry," and she couldn't bear to wait anymore. She raised her hand and knocked once. Soft, hesitant. Then again harder. The iron was freezing beneath her fingers. "I'm not asking for money," she murmured into the storm, her voice almost swallowed by the rain. "Just work. Any work. For him." For a heartbeat, it seemed the storm itself was her only witness. But inside, behind the dark glass, someone was moving. From the warmth of his study, Daniel Reed stood before the security monitors, watching the rain paint distorted rivers across the camera lens. The storm blurred the outlines of the figure at the gate, but the small shape in her arms was unmistakable. A child. He leaned closer, adjusting the focus. The woman's coat clung to her, soaked through, her face pale with cold. Yet it wasn't her expression that made his chest tighten. It was the boy. The child shifted, his small hand visible for just a moment as he adjusted his grip on something. Daniel's breath caught. Keychain. Metal scratched with years of wear, shaped like a wrench. It was ordinary. A souvenir you could find in a dozen auto shops across the Midwest. Except Daniel knew it wasn't ordinary, because once, years ago, he had bought one just like it. He remembered the day vividly. His younger brother, Mark, teasing him about being too sentimental. Daniel had pressed the trinket into his hand anyway. "Something to keep on your keys," he'd said, "so you don't lose them all the time." Mark had laughed, pocketed it, and promised he'd never take it off. He hadn't. Not until the accident. Daniel's stomach knotted. He hadn't thought about that day in years. Couldn't. The memory had been buried beneath work, success, endless hours at the company that had turned his name into a headline. But seeing that keychain in the boy's hand was like watching a ghost move through the rain. The boy leaned into his mother's chest, oblivious, clutching it as though it were nothing more than a toy. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand trembling against the desk. Logic told him it was coincidence. The world was full of small tokens and meaningless overlaps. But grief had no logic. It lived in shadows and echoes. He turned up the volume on the gate's intercom. Her voice came through, faint, nearly drowned by the storm. "I'm not asking for money. Just work. Any work. For him." Her words cut through him more sharply than she could have known. Because years ago, someone else had spoken almost the same to him. His brother, standing in this very room, asking Daniel to slow down, to share the weight, to remember there was more to life than deals and deadlines. Daniel hadn't listened then, and the next week Mark was gone. Daniel pressed the release. The gate clicked open. Like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy the story. The woman startled, glancing toward the sound, then pushed forward. Her shoes splashed through puddles as she half-carried, half-dragged herself and her son up the long drive. Daniel didn't move to meet them. He watched instead, through glass and rain, his throat tight with something dangerously close to hope or fear. When the doorbell rang, the chime echoed too loudly through the cavernous halls. Daniel let the housekeeper answer. He stood back in the shadows of the entryway as Megan stepped inside, cradling her son. Water dripped from her coat onto the polished floor. She looked small in the vast space, not just in stature but in presence, as if she'd been diminished by years of struggle. Yet her chin was lifted, her eyes steady. "Please," she said softly. "I can clean, cook, anything. Just not charity. I need to earn it." Daniel's gaze flicked again to the boy. Noah, she had called him at the gate. The child had curls plastered damp against his forehead, his lashes heavy with rain. He was fighting sleep, still gripping the keychain tightly in one small hand. Daniel's chest ached. He wanted to ask, "Where did you get that? Who gave it to you?" But the words tangled and died before they could leave him. Instead, he simply nodded once, curt, his voice quiet but firm. "You can stay tonight." The housekeeper blinked at him in surprise. Megan let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob, though she bit it back quickly. She smoothed her son's hair and whispered, "Thank you." Daniel turned away before she could see his face. He didn't want her gratitude. He didn't want her questions. He only wanted time to think, to breathe, to understand why the past had just walked through his door. The mansion swallowed them whole. The heavy doors closed, muffling the storm into nothing more than a faint percussion against glass. Inside, the silence was vast, pressing, broken only by the sound of Noah's quiet whimper as he shifted in his mother's arms. The housekeeper, Mrs. Latham, appeared uncertain, glancing at Daniel for direction. In all her years of service, she had never seen him open the door to a stranger, much less a woman carrying a child. "Prepare the guest wing," Daniel said finally, his voice low, detached. "Make sure there's food ready." Mrs. Latham hesitated a moment, then inclined her head and disappeared into the hallway. Megan shifted Noah against her shoulder, her arms trembling from exhaustion. She stood just inside the entryway, not daring to step further. The marble floor gleamed beneath her muddy shoes, and the chandeliers above seemed absurdly bright, like a stage she did not belong on. "I don't want to intrude," she murmured. "You won't," Daniel interrupted, not looking at her. His eyes lingered on the boy instead. "Stay tonight." Megan's lips pressed into a line, pride and need colliding in her chest. She hated this, the imbalance, the feeling of being a beggar in a palace. But Noah stirred again, whispering, "Mommy," and that settled it. Survival first, dignity later. Mrs. Latham returned with quiet efficiency. "The guest room is prepared." Megan nodded her thanks and followed the housekeeper through echoing corridors. She caught glimpses as they walked, long hallways with portraits whose faces seemed to watch her, a staircase curving into shadows, closed doors that radiated stories she would never know. The air smelled faintly of cedar and polish, but beneath it lingered something emptier, colder, like a space long and used to laughter. The guest room was more than she expected. A soft bed, a heavy quilt, lamps that glowed with warm light. Megan lowered Noah gently onto the mattress. His fist remained clenched around the keychain even in sleep. She pulled off his wet shoes, tucked the blanket under his chin, and smoothed his curls until his breathing steadied. When she turned, Daniel was in the doorway. She startled. She hadn't heard him approach. "You'll find fresh towels in the bathroom," he said. "Mrs. Latham will bring food." Megan swallowed, then squared her shoulders. "I can clean in the morning. Windows, floors, whatever you need. I don't take something for nothing." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. His gaze drifted past her, to the old lamp on the dresser. Dust clung to its brass base, the shade askew. He remembered it instantly. Mark had chosen it at a flea market, laughing at its crooked charm. Daniel had always meant to throw it out but never could. And now this woman, this stranger, was standing in front of it, speaking with the same stubborn conviction his brother once had. "Do what you want," he said finally, his tone sharper than he intended. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the hollow corridors. That night, Megan found the promised food. Soup still warm, bread soft as though it had just been pulled from an oven. She ate only a little, saving most for morning, while Noah slept deeply beside her. Before bed, she wandered the room. She straightened the lamp, wiped its shade with the edge of her sleeve, and pressed the switch. To her surprise, it flickered to life, casting a steady golden glow. She smiled faintly. "Not broken, just neglected," she whispered. In another part of the house, Daniel paused mid-step as he noticed the sudden light spill from beneath the guest room door. His chest tightened. That lamp had remained dark for years. The simple act of her repairing it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The next morning Megan rose early. True to her word, she searched for work. She found a linen closet, gathered supplies, and began with the marble floor outside their room. On her knees, scrubbing, she felt almost whole again, like she was giving something back. When she paused to rest, she found a folded blanket neatly placed near the door. Too fine to belong to her, too deliberate to be a coincidence. Beside it, a small toy truck, bright red. Noah's name wasn't on it, but somehow it was meant for him. Megan touched the blanket, her throat tightening. A gesture of care, silent, left without witness. She understood then. He would not speak it, but he would give in small, quiet ways. She whispered, "Thank you," though the hallway was empty. Daniel, watching from a distance on the security screen, heard nothing. But he saw her pause, saw the way her hand lingered on the blanket before she carried it inside. And for the first time in years, the corners of his mouth softened. Not quite a smile, but something close. Megan moved through the house quietly, as if afraid to disturb it. Each morning, after feeding Noah, she found work for her hands. Dusting shelves, folding laundry no one used, polishing the banister of the grand staircase. She never asked permission. She simply did. The mansion gave her enough to do. It was beautiful, yes, but also strangely neglected. The garden outside was overgrown, ivy crawling high over stone walls. The hallways echoed with silence, doors closed as though guarding secrets. More than once she passed a room locked tight. A nursery, she guessed, from the faint shapes glimpsed through frosted glass. She didn't linger. Some wounds didn't need trespassing. Still, little by little, she left touches of life. A vase filled with branches she gathered from the garden. A rug shaken free of dust. Curtains pulled open to let the light through. Small things, but in their wake, the house began to look less abandoned. One evening, in the guest room, Megan turned her attention to the old lamp she had straightened before. The shade still sat crooked, and she noticed a loose wire along its base. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, she worked at it carefully with a borrowed screwdriver, murmuring to herself while Noah stacked blocks nearby. The lamp flickered, then steadied into a warm, steady glow. She smiled, satisfied. There, good as new. She didn't know that the lamp had once sat in Daniel's brother's room, that his brother had carried it into this house with laughter, insisting its imperfections made it worth keeping. Daniel had kept it untouched all these years, not out of affection, but because he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. When Daniel passed the guest room door that night and saw the lamp shining through the crack, his chest tightened sharply. It was as if the past had slipped back into the present, uninvited. He stood there longer than he should have, one hand braced against the wall. The simple glow unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. Later, as he sat alone in his study, he poured a drink but left it untouched. The glass trembled faintly in his hand. Everywhere he looked, the house seemed altered, softened. Curtains drawn back, floors shining. A faint scent of lemon polish replacing the stale air. It was still his house, still full of shadows, but now it carried someone else's fingerprints. He closed his eyes and for a brief, dangerous moment he imagined the sound of his brother's laughter again, echoing down these same halls. The illusion was so sharp he had to stand, pacing until the memory receded. Down the hall, Megan tucked Noah into bed. She smoothed his hair and whispered a lullaby, her voice barely more than a hum. In the dark, the glow of the repaired lamp kept watch beside them, steady and patient. And in another room, Daniel sat rigid in silence, staring into shadows he thought he had buried years ago. The storm returned days later, heavier than before. Rain swept against the city, thunder low and restless above the skyline. Inside the mansion, the lights flickered once, twice, then gave out entirely. The silence afterward was broken only by the distant groan of wind through the chimneys. Daniel cursed under his breath, checking the switch. Dead. The backup generator he had never bothered to repair would remain silent too. He stood for a moment, staring at the darkened screen of his phone, the uselessness of it sharpening his isolation. From down the hall, faint laughter spilled through the stillness. He froze. It wasn't loud, not disruptive, soft, rolling, warm. The sound of a child. Noah. Daniel followed the glow of flickering light until he reached the guest wing. The door was half open, a thin strip of gold cutting across the floor. He paused in the shadows. Inside, Megan had lit candles. Mismatched, pulled from drawers, set into saucers and cups. Their flames swayed, throwing long shadows against the wall. Noah sat cross-legged on the bed, eyes wide in the glow, while Megan's voice spun a story. "Once upon a time," she said softly, "there was a boy who thought the moon belonged only to him. Every night, he'd wave at it from his window, and the moon would shine a little brighter, as if waving back. But one night the boy was sad, and the moon disappeared. He searched everywhere until he realized." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The moon hadn't left. It had only hidden behind clouds, waiting for the boy to laugh again. Noah giggled, clapping his small hands. The sound rang pure, unguarded. Daniel's hand tightened against the doorframe. That laugh. It was high, bright, with a sharp edge that was achingly familiar. He had heard it before, years ago, echoing across summer lawns. It was the same laugh his nephew once carried. Mark's little boy, lost in the accident alongside his father. For a moment Daniel couldn't breathe. His vision blurred, not from the candlelight but from memory. He saw his brother crouched in the grass, tossing his son into the air, both of them laughing with the exact rhythm he had just heard again. Megan noticed him then. She didn't startle, only looked at him steadily across the candlelight. She must have seen the strain on his face, because her voice softened. "Some pain never leaves," she said, quiet but certain. "It just needs someone willing to help carry it." The words hung between them, heavy and true. Daniel stepped into the room almost against his will, drawn by something he couldn't name. He sat on the edge of the armchair in the corner, stiff, as if ready to flee. Noah looked at him curiously, then picked up the toy truck Daniel had left days earlier and drove it across the blanket. His laughter returned, brighter this time. Megan reached to steady one of the candles. The light touched her face, showing exhaustion beneath her strength, the shadows under her eyes, the careful set of her mouth. Yet she looked calm, present. Daniel watched her for a long moment. Then, before he could stop himself, he asked, "Where did he get that keychain?" Megan blinked, surprised by the question. "The wrench." She glanced at Noah, who was still gripping it loosely. "It was his father's. I don't talk about him much." Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to press, to ask for details, to chase the thread of impossible coincidence. But the look on her face, protective, weary, stopped him. Instead he only nodded, leaning back into silence. The three of them sat together in the golden glow of candlelight. The storm outside howled, but inside there was warmth, small and fragile, like something borrowed. When Noah finally drifted to sleep, his toy truck in one hand and the keychain in the other, Megan adjusted the blanket over him. She didn't look at Daniel, only whispered, "Thank you for letting us stay." He could have told her it was nothing, that it wasn't kindness, only impulse. But the words refused to form. Instead, he stood, lingering one last moment in the glow, before retreating back into the shadows of his house. Yet as he walked the long hallways, the sound of Noah's laughter stayed with him, echoing in places where silence had lived for too long. For a time, the house remained their secret world. Megan rose early each morning, scrubbing floors, dusting shelves, tending to the neglected garden until her hands grew raw. Noah followed her like a shadow, sometimes tumbling through the halls with laughter that made the silence less oppressive. Daniel drifted in and out of their days without explanation, distant but never absent. He left quiet offerings behind. A new blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed, a carton of strawberries in the kitchen, a pair of shoes Noah could grow into. But secrets never stayed hidden for long. One afternoon, Megan was bent over the roses near the side gate, pruning carefully, when she heard the sharp click of a camera shutter. She straightened at once, shielding her eyes from the sun. The gardener, a thin man with restless eyes and a phone always in his pocket, stood by the hedge, his device lifted. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharper than she meant. He shrugged, too casual. "Just taking a picture. Strange company you keep, Ms. Carter." Before she could answer, he turned and walked away. She felt unease knot in her stomach, but she said nothing. That evening, while she tucked Noah into bed, she whispered to herself, "It's fine. No one cares about us." She was wrong. The photo appeared online within hours. A grainy image of Megan in the garden, Noah crouched beside her, paired with a headline, "Billionaire Daniel Reed hides homeless woman and child in his mansion." By morning, it was everywhere. Reporters swarmed the gates. Cameras flashed from the street, their lenses hunting for a glimpse through the iron bars. Vans lined the road. Satellite dishes pointed skyward. The once empty mansion became the center of a storm. Inside, Megan stood frozen at the window, her arms wrapped tightly around Noah. He clung to her shirt, frightened by the voices shouting beyond the gate. "They'll twist everything," she whispered, her throat raw. "They'll say I—" Her words broke off. She couldn't finish. Daniel entered the room without knocking. He carried himself differently now. Shoulders squared, eyes hard, the calm of a man used to boardrooms and headlines. "They want a story," he said evenly. "I'll give them one." Before Megan could protest, he was gone. When the gates opened, the noise swelled. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward, accusations cutting through the air. Daniel stepped into view, tall and immovable, his dark coat whipping in the wind. "You've seen the photo," he began, his voice carrying easily. "And you've written your captions. But let me make something clear." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Cameras clicked frantically. "This woman is not a con artist, not a gold digger. She is someone who reminded me how to live when I'd forgotten how. You can write whatever headlines you like about me, but if you insult her again—" His jaw tightened, eyes burning into the crowd. "You'll answer to me." The noise faltered. Even the most aggressive reporters hesitated. Daniel turned without another word, the gates closing behind him. Inside, Megan stood in the hall, Noah pressed against her hip. She had heard everything. When Daniel re-entered, their eyes met. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to argue, to say anything at all, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she only held Noah closer, her chest aching with something dangerous, something she had sworn not to feel again: trust. The frenzy outside the mansion eventually burned itself out. Reporters lingered for days, hoping for another headline, but the story grew stale and the vans rolled away. The iron gates closed to silence again. Yet inside, nothing had returned to the way it was. Megan noticed it first in the small things. Daniel no longer disappeared for hours into his study, sealing the door behind him like a wall. He lingered in doorways when she read to Noah. He sat at the table when she cooked, even if he said little. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would place a book in front of her, one he thought she might like, and then pretend to be busy so she wouldn't feel pressured to read it. Noah, however, noticed Daniel most of all. He began to follow him, trailing after his long strides with quick little steps, carrying his toy truck everywhere. At first Daniel seemed uncertain, awkward even, unsure how to answer a child's constant questions. Why is the sky loud when it rains? Why do the doors in your house make echoes? Do you have a dog? But slowly, something softened. He started kneeling down to Noah's level, explaining things in simple words, showing him how to wind the grandfather clock or turn the handle of the old globe in the library. The bond grew quietly, almost invisibly, until one evening it broke open in a single instant. Noah had been running down the polished hallway after dinner, the red truck clutched in his hand. His little shoes slipped on the smooth floor and he fell hard, his cry sharp and frightened. Megan dropped the dish she was holding and ran, heart hammering, but Daniel was already there. He lifted Noah into his arms without hesitation. "Shoo, you're all right?" Daniel murmured, his hand brushing the boy's curls back from his wet cheeks. His voice was low, steady, the kind of tone that carried safety. And then it happened. Noah's sobs hiccuped into silence, his arms wrapped tight around Daniel's neck. Through his tears, he whispered a single word. "Daddy." The world seemed to still. Megan froze mid-step, her breath caught in her chest. Daniel stiffened, as though the word had struck him like a physical blow. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Noah buried his face against Daniel's shoulder, clinging as if he had always belonged there. Something in Daniel cracked open, not with pain but with surrender. The walls he had built, stone by stone, to keep grief from consuming him collapsed under the weight of that tiny, unguarded word. Megan's eyes burned. She wanted to correct her son, to explain. But when she saw Daniel's expression, the fierce tenderness there, she said nothing. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep, Megan walked into the dining room and stopped short. On the long table, empty except for 2 untouched plates, lay a single sunflower. Its yellow petals glowed softly in the dim light, dew still clinging to its stem as if freshly cut. Beside it, on thick folded paper, was a note in Daniel's unmistakable hand. "Stay. Not because you need me, because I need you." Her fingers trembled as she touched the flower. For a long time she stood there, the words pressing deep into her chest. She whispered, barely audible, "You don't know how much I needed to hear that." The days that followed unfolded differently. The mansion, once a mausoleum, slowly began to breathe again. Sunlight poured through curtains Megan refused to keep closed. Laughter carried down staircases. The locked nursery was opened at last. Dust lifted from forgotten toys as Noah set them in motion again. Megan planted herbs in the overgrown garden, and soon the scent of mint and basil drifted through the kitchen. And Daniel, he walked the halls with a new weight in his step, but not the old one of grief. It was responsibility, perhaps, or the fragile beginning of belonging. In the evenings he would kneel to tie Noah's shoes, or linger in the kitchen doorway to watch Megan hum as she cooked. Once, Megan looked up to find him not staring at the food, but at her. And the look was not pity, nor charity, but something deeper. The house was no longer silent, carried voices again. Soft ones, ordinary ones, the kind that filled emptiness with life. What had begun as a desperate knock in the rain was no longer desperation. It was the beginning of a family. Not perfect, not simple, but chosen. And for the first time in years, Daniel Reed allowed himself to believe in something he thought he had lost forever: home.